They were given a name that history prefers to forget: comfort girls. Emaciated Japanese women, trembling as they stepped into an Allied POW camp, bracing themselves to face American soldiers they believed would torture them. But instead of rifles and screams, they were handed something that made them weep: cheeseburgers and sandwiches. For the first time in years of having their dignity and strength drained away, they ate a real meal. But why would former enemies treat them so kindly? And what happened after those tears fell? The Pacific Theater, August 1945. The war that had consumed millions of lives was gasping its final breaths. On a small island south of Okinawa, smoke still rose from shattered bunkers and burned-out artillery positions. Japanese forces were in full retreat, abandoning equipment, supplies, and sometimes people. In a wooden structure hidden among palm trees, 17 young women huddled together in the oppressive heat. They ranged in age from 16 to 24. Their clothes were little more than rags. Their faces carried the hollow look of those who had stopped hoping long ago. These were the women the Imperial Japanese Army had called comfort girls, a sterile euphemism for a brutal reality. Most had been deceived with promises of factory work or nursing positions. Others had simply been taken. For months or years, they had existed in a nightmare where their bodies were not their own, where each day blurred into the next in an endless cycle of degradation. Sarah Kimura was 21. Before the war, she had studied poetry and dreamed of becoming a teacher. Now she couldn't remember the last time she had written anything except numbers in the logbook she'd been forced to maintain. Her hands shook constantly, even when she tried to hold them still. Beside her sat Akiko Tanaka, 19, who had once sung in her village's festival choir. She hadn't sung in 2 years. The sound of her own voice frightened her now. It reminded her too much of the screams she couldn't forget. When the bombing intensified 3 days ago, the Japanese officers had fled without a word. They left behind supplies, weapons, and the women. No evacuation orders, no instructions, just silence, and the distant thunder of American artillery drawing closer. The women knew what was coming. They had heard the stories propaganda fed to them by their captors about the barbaric Americans who would do unspeakable things to Japanese women. After what they had already endured, their imaginations painted horrors even darker. "They will kill us," whispered Reiko Matsumoto, the youngest at 16. She had stopped crying days ago. There were no tears left. "Maybe that would be better," replied Harumi Sato, 24, the oldest. She had been here the longest. Her eyes held a peculiar emptiness that came from having survived too much. They could hear vehicles now, moving through the jungle. American voices calling out in a language that sounded harsh and alien. The women pressed themselves into the corners of the wooden building, some clutching each other, others simply staring at nothing. Sarah found herself thinking about her mother's garden back in Kyoto. The cherry blossoms in spring. The way rain sounded on their tile roof. Small, beautiful things that seemed to belong to another lifetime, another world where she had been a different person entirely. The door would open soon. They all knew it. And when it did, they believed their suffering would either end or begin anew. There seemed to be no third option. Corporal James Mitchell was 23 years old and tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. He had been fighting across the Pacific for 18 months, and every island looked the same after a while. Shattered palm trees, cratered earth, and the smell of death that never quite washed away. His scouting yai consisted of 5 men moving carefully through the abandoned Japanese position. They had learned to be cautious. Booby traps were common, and desperate soldiers sometimes hid for days waiting to take one last shot. "Sir, over here," called Private Robert Chen, a second-generation American who spoke fluent Japanese. He was pointing at a wooden structure eerily concealed by vegetation. Mitchell approached cautiously, rifle ready. Then he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. Crying. Multiple voices. Trying to be quiet, but failing. "Cover me," he said, approaching the door. "Could be a trap," warned Sergeant Frank Morrison. "That's not soldiers crying," Mitchell replied. He pushed the door open slowly, letting light spill into the dim interior. What he saw made him freeze. 17 women, skeletal and terrified, pressed against the back wall like cornered animals. Their clothing was inadequate, their faces gaunt, but it was their eyes that hit him. Hardest eyes that held no hope. Only the dull acceptance of more pain to come. One woman, perhaps sensing an opportunity, prostrated herself on the floor, forehead pressed to the wooden planks, mumbling in Japanese. "Chen, what's she saying?" Mitchell asked quietly. Private Chen's voice was unsteady when he answered. She's begging us to kill her quickly, sir. She's saying, please don't make it hurt." The words landed like physical blows. Mitchell had seen terrible things in this war. But this was different. These weren't enemy soldiers. They were victims of the same war that had taken so much from everyone. "Nobody's going to hurt you," Mitchell said, though he knew they couldn't understand. "Chen, tell them. Tell them they're safe now." Chen spoke in Japanese, his voice deliberately calm and gentle. The women didn't move. They had heard promises before. Mitchell slowly lowered his rifle and removed his helmet, trying to appear less threatening. He gestured to his canteen and held it out. "Water," he said. "Just water." One woman, slightly older than the others, looked at him with calculating eyes. She had learned to read men, to predict what they wanted. But this behavior didn't fit any pattern she knew. Mitchell set the canteen on the floor and stepped back. "Sergeant Morrison, get on the radio. Tell command we need medical personnel and female staff immediately. And tell them," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Tell them, we've found civilians in severe distress." "What happened to them, sir?" asked young Private David Walsh, barely 18 himself. Mitchell looked at the terrified women and felt something break inside his chest. "Things no one should have to survive, Walsh. Now go help Chen explain that we're taking them somewhere safe." The next 30 minutes were delicate. Chen spoke slowly, repeatedly, explaining that they would be taken to the American camp, given medical care, and protected. The women listened but didn't believe. Why would they? Trust had been beaten out of them long ago. Finally, Mitchell made a decision. He sat down on the floor, cross-legged, and opened his pack. He pulled out a chocolate bar, precious cargo he'd been saving, and broke off a piece. He ate it himself first, then offered another piece to the nearest woman. She stared at it for a long moment. Then, moving slowly as if afraid sudden movement would shatter this strange dream, she reached out and took it. The sweetness on her tongue was almost painful. She began to cry again. But differently this time. "We're going to get you out of here," Mitchell said softly. "I promise." Whether she understood his words or just his tone, something shifted. The woman nodded slightly. Getting them to move was a slow process, but eventually, all 17 women emerged from the wooden building into daylight. Some squinted, as if they hadn't been outside in days. Others kept their heads down, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The march back to the American camp took 2 hours. Mitchell's squad formed a protective perimeter around the women, speaking in low voices, offering water when anyone stumbled. This wasn't in any training manual. They were making it up as they went, guided only by basic human decency. As they approached the camp perimeter, Mitchell radioed ahead one more time. "This is Scout Unit 7. Tell Colonel Patterson we have 17 female civilians, Japanese nationals, in urgent need of medical care and protection. And tell him," he paused, looking back at the hollow-eyed women trudging behind him. "Tell him we're going to need to do this right." The medical tent had never handled anything like this. Captain Elizabeth Harrison, the chief nurse, had treated gunshot wounds, burns, tropical diseases, and psychological trauma. But this was different. These women flinched at every sound, every shadow. "We need a separate area," she told Colonel Richard Patterson, the camp commander. "They can't be near the main POW section. They're not prisoners, they're survivors." Patterson, a 45-year-old career officer who had seen his share of horrors, nodded grimly. "Set up the auxiliary tent. Post guards, but tell them to keep their distance. I want only female personnel inside, unless absolutely necessary." Elizabeth worked quickly, recruiting 2 other nurses, Lieutenant Mary Thompson and Corporal Alice Wu. Together, they prepared 17 cots with clean sheets, set out soap and towels, and arranged for hot water. When the women arrived, they looked at the cots with confusion. Sarah touched the white sheet tentatively, as if it might disappear. In 2 years, she had slept on wooden planks with a thin mat if she was lucky. Bath, Elizabeth said, gesturing. She had Chen translate more thoroughly. The women hesitated. Bathing meant being vulnerable, exposed. But the smell of soap was enticing, and the promise of cleanliness after so long was too powerful to resist. They bathed in small groups, never alone, always watching the tent entrance. Mary and Alice provided towels and simple cotton shifts that were vastly too large but infinitely better than what they'd been wearing. When they emerged, clean for the first time in months or years, something subtle had changed in their faces. Not hope exactly, but perhaps the first tiny crack in their despair. Elizabeth examined each woman briefly, noting wounds, malnutrition, and other signs of prolonged abuse. She kept her face neutral, professional, but inside she felt a burning rage at what had been done to these young women. They need calories, she told her staff. But start slow, their systems can't handle too much at once. Broth tonight, soft foods tomorrow. As evening fell, the women sat on their cots, wrapped in blankets despite the tropical heat. They had learned that being cold was better than other things. The blankets were a form of armor, however thin. Chen sat near the tent entrance, available to translate but trying not to intrude. A few guards stood outside, carefully positioned to protect without threatening. When dinner arrived, simple vegetable broth and soft bread, the women stared at it. They had eaten, if the word could be used, but rarely anything this fresh or this much. Harumi, the eldest, lifted her bowl and sipped cautiously. The warm broth went down smoothly, and she felt her body respond with something like gratitude. She said something in Japanese. What did she say? Elizabeth asked Chen. She said she forgot food could taste like something other than survival. One by one, the other women began eating. Some cried quietly as they ate. Others simply stared at their bowls, as if they might contain answers to questions they were afraid to ask. Private Walsh, who had been of the rescue team, stood guard outside. He could hear the soft sounds of weeping mixed with the clink of spoons against bowls. He thought about his 2 younger sisters back in Ohio and felt sick thinking about anyone treating them the way these women had been treated. "You okay, Walsh?" asked Mitchell, who had come to check on the situation. "I don't understand, sir." "How could anyone?" "Don't try to understand it," Mitchell said quietly. "Just help us make sure they're safe now. That's all we can do." Inside the tent, Elizabeth sat with Akiko, the young woman who had once loved to sing. Akiko was having a panic attack, hyperventilating and clawing at her arms. Elizabeth gently took her hands. "Breathe with me," she said, even though Akiko couldn't understand the words. She demonstrated long, slow breaths. Gradually, Akiko's breathing slowed. She looked at Elizabeth with those haunted eyes, and for just a moment, Elizabeth saw past the trauma to the young woman she had been before all this. "You're safe," Elizabeth whispered. "I know you can't believe it yet, but you're safe." As night deepened, the women lay on their cots, most unable to sleep despite their exhaustion. They waited for the other shoe to drop, for the cruelty they knew must be coming, because in their experience, kindness was always a prelude to something worse. But the night passed quietly. The guards changed shifts outside, but never entered. The nurses checked on them periodically, but didn't disturb anyone who wanted to be left alone. And slowly, incrementally, some of the women began to relax their death grip on consciousness and slip into something resembling sleep. Sarah dreamed of cherry blossoms. It was the first dream in months that wasn't a nightmare. Morning came with the sound of birds and distant activity in the camp. The women woke slowly, disoriented. For a moment, each one had to remember where she was, had to convince herself that yesterday had actually happened. Elizabeth arrived early with Mary and Alice. "Good morning," she said with a warm smile. "We have breakfast." The word breakfast meant little to them until they saw what the kitchen staff had prepared. This wasn't the usual military rations. Corporal Thomas Bennett, the head cook, had stayed up late thinking about what these women needed. He brought out fresh bread, grilled meat, cheese, tomatoes, lettuce, ingredients he'd been saving for an officer's dinner. He assembled them into what American soldiers called sandwiches, stacking them high. He also prepared several cheeseburgers, thinking the protein and fat might help restore their strength. "It's not fancy," he told Elizabeth, "but it's real food. Good food." When the trays arrived in the tent, the women stared. They had never seen bread like this thick and soft. They had never seen cheese melted over meat. The portions were enormous compared to what they'd been given before. Chen came in to help explain. "This is called a sandwich," he said in Japanese, holding one up. "You hold it like this and bite. The Americans eat this all the time. It's very normal for them." Sarah reached out tentatively and picked up a cheeseburger. It was warm in her hands, almost too heavy to hold. She looked at Elizabeth, who nodded encouragingly. She took a small bite. The sensation was overwhelming. The rich taste of meat, the creaminess of melted cheese, the soft bread her taste buds, so long accustomed to bland rice and watery soup, couldn't process it. She chewed slowly, and then she began to cry. Not quiet tears this time, but deep, shaking sobs. She clutched the burger to her chest like something precious, while her whole body trembled. "What's wrong?" Elizabeth asked urgently, moving toward her. "Chen, what did I do wrong?" But Chen was watching the other women, who were now also crying as they bit into sandwiches and burgers. "They're not upset," he said, his own voice thick. I think they're crying because it tastes good. Because someone is feeding them real food. Because they're being treated like human beings." Reiko, the youngest, had taken a bite of a sandwich and couldn't stop the tears streaming down her face. "It's so good," she whispered in Japanese. "I forgot food could be this good. I forgot I could feel this." Harumi was crying too, but she was also eating steadily, as if afraid the food might be taken away. Between bites, she said something to Chen. She says, Chen translated, struggling with his own emotions. She says, "Thank you for not making them beg for this." She says in her old life, before the war, her mother made her sandwiches for school. She never thought she would taste anything like that again. Mitchell had come in to check on things and found himself witnessing something he hadn't expected. 17 broken women, crying over cheeseburgers and sandwiches, not because they were hungry, though they were, but because this simple act of feeding them properly was the first genuine kindness they'd received in years. Private Walsh, standing just outside, heard the crying and stepped in, concerned. When he saw what was happening, he felt his eyes burn. He quickly turned away, but not before Akiko saw his face. She said something in Japanese, looking directly at him. "What did she say?" Walsh asked Chen. She said, "Your face is kind. She said she can see you have a good heart." She said, "Thank you." Walsh nodded, not trusting his voice to respond. As the women ate slowly, carefully, savoring every bite, the tension in the tent began to ease. Not dramatically, not completely, but enough to notice. They were still frightened, still traumatized, still uncertain about tomorrow. But right now, in this moment, they were eating real food, and people were treating them with dignity. Elizabeth sat down on a supply crate and watched them. Mary came to stand beside her. "I've never seen anything like this," Mary said quietly. "Neither have I," Elizabeth replied. "But I think we're seeing what happens when you give starving people food and traumatized people safety. Even a little bit makes a difference." Sarah finished her cheeseburger and sat holding the empty wrapper. She thought about how strange it was that something as simple as food could feel like a gift, like proof that the world still contained goodness. She had forgotten that. She had truly believed there was nothing good left anywhere. "More?" Elizabeth asked, gesturing to the remaining sandwiches. Sarah nodded, and this time when she ate, she cried less and smiled more. 3 days had passed. The women were eating more regularly now, their bodies slowly adjusting to proper nutrition. They no longer flinched quite as dramatically at every sound, though they still watched the tent entrance constantly. Colonel Patterson decided it was time to understand their full situation. He assembled a small team. Elizabeth, Chen, Mitchell, and himself. They entered the tent mid-morning, when the women seemed most calm. Patterson sat down on a folding chair he deliberately chose not to stand, wanting to be at eye level rather than looming over them. Chen sat beside him, ready to translate. "Ladies," Patterson began, and Chen translated, "I need to understand what happened to you. Not because I doubt you've suffered, but because I need to know how to help you properly, and because what was done to you is a war crime that needs to be documented." The women looked at each other. Speaking about it meant reliving it. But they also sensed that this man genuinely wanted to help. Harumi spoke first. She was the eldest, and perhaps felt responsible for the younger ones. Her voice was flat, emotionless, the only way she could get through it. She told them about being recruited for factory work in 1943, about arriving at a military station and realizing it was all a lie, about the first night when she understood what her real purpose would be, about the months and years that followed, where each day was indistinguishable from the last except for the faces of the men who used her. Chen translated in a quiet, respectful voice, though his hands shook slightly. Sarah spoke next. Her story similar, but with different details. She had been taken from her village after her father was conscripted. She described the wooden buildings, the quotas, the log books, the complete erasure of their humanity. Reiko couldn't speak about it directly. She could only say, "They took everything. Everything I was before. I don't know how to be a person anymore." As the stories poured out, the four Americans sat in complete silence. Patterson, who had commanded men through brutal battles, who had seen death and destruction across the Pacific, felt tears on his face and didn't bother to wipe them away. Mitchell's jaw was clenched so tight it ached. He thought about his fiancée back home, about the life they planned to build, and he felt a white-hot rage at the men who had done this. Elizabeth had heard of this already through her medical examinations, but hearing it directly, in their own words, was different. She made a mental note to recommend psychiatric support. These women would need help processing trauma for years to come. When they finished, the tent was silent except for quiet crying. Not just from the women, but from some of the Americans too. Patterson stood slowly. "Ladies," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion, "what was done to you is unforgivable. The men responsible are war criminals, and if there's any justice, they'll answer for it. But here's what I can promise you right now. While you're in this camp, under my command, no one will hurt you again. No one will use you. No one will disrespect you. You will be fed, clothed, cared for medically, and treated with the dignity you deserve. That's my word as an officer and as a human being." Chen translated, and for the first time, some of the women looked like they wanted to believe. Sarah spoke up. "Why?" she asked. "We are Japanese. You are American. We are enemies. Why would you help us?" Patterson met her eyes. "Because before we're Japanese or American, we're all human beings, and what happened to you is wrong no matter what uniform anyone wears. If we can't recognize that, then what are we even fighting for?" Those words, translated by Chen, seemed to shift something fundamental. It wasn't immediate trust. Trust would take much longer, but it was the beginning of a possibility that maybe, just maybe, these Americans meant what they said. Sergeant Morrison stepped forward. "Sir, if I may." Patterson nodded. Morrison addressed the women directly. "I have 3 daughters back home. They're younger than most of you, but not by much. If someone did to them what was done to you, I'd want to kill everyone responsible. But I'd also want someone, anyone, to help them heal, to show them that not every person in the world is a monster. That's what we're trying to do here." Akiko, who had barely spoken since arriving, said something softly. "What did she say?" Morrison asked. Chen's voice was gentle. She said your daughters are lucky to have a father who thinks like that. She said her own father died in the war and never knew what happened to her. She said she's glad he didn't know. The pain in those words was unbearable. Elizabeth stood up. Ladies, I'm going to establish a more permanent care area for you. Better facilities, more privacy. And I'm going to arrange for counseling support. We have a chaplain who's trained in trauma care, and if you'd prefer, we can try to find Japanese-speaking support. Also, Patterson added, I'm establishing a new camp policy. This area is off-limits to everyone except assigned medical personnel and female staff. The guards will be posted at a distance. Anyone who violates this will answer to me personally. As the team prepared to leave, Harumi stood up. Colonel, she said through Chen, thank you for the food. Thank you for treating us like people. We know you didn't have to. Patterson's voice was firm. Yes, we did have to. That's what being human means. That evening, as word spread through the camp about what these women had endured, the attitude of the American soldiers shifted noticeably. There was anger, certainly, but also a fierce protective instinct. These women had been through hell. The least these soldiers could do was make sure their hell was over. 2 weeks had passed since the women arrived at the camp. The change, while subtle, was real. Sarah had gained 6 pounds. Her face wasn't quite as hollow, and her hands didn't shake constantly anymore. She had started helping Elizabeth organize medical supplies, small tasks that gave her a sense of purpose. How do you say this in English? She asked Chen one afternoon, pointing to a bandage. Bandage, he replied, carefully pronouncing it. Bandage, she repeated, her accent heavy but earnest. This became a pattern. The women started learning basic English words. Safe, friend, food, water, thank you. Chen held informal lessons, using pictures and objects to teach. It gave them something to focus on besides their trauma. Reiko discovered she enjoyed drawing. Elizabeth had found some paper and pencils, thinking art might be therapeutic. Reiko began sketching the palm trees outside the tent, the birds, Elizabeth's face. Her drawings were good, she had natural talent. You could be an artist, Elizabeth told her through Chen. Reiko looked surprised, as if she'd forgotten she could be anything at all. Akiko still hadn't sung, but sometimes Elizabeth caught her humming quietly while folding laundry, another small task they'd been given, more to provide routine than because the work was needed. The humming was so soft it was barely audible, but it was there. A tiny piece of her old self emerging. The camp chaplain, Captain Robert Williams, visited weekly. He was a gentleman in his 50s who had lost his own daughter to illness years ago. He didn't preach or lecture. He just sat and listened, offering presence rather than platitudes. You don't have to believe in God, he told them through Chen. You don't have to believe in anything, but I believe in you. I believe you'll survive this and find lives worth living again. Harumi spoke with him most often. She had questions about justice, about punishment, about whether the men who'd done this would ever answer for it. I don't know, Williams admitted. War crimes trials are beginning, but whether every guilty person will face consequences, I honestly don't know. But I do know that your survival is its own form of victory. They tried to destroy you and failed. We're not whole, Harumi said. No one who's been through war is whole, Williams replied. Not them, not us, not anyone. We're all carrying pieces of broken inside. But broken doesn't mean worthless. Sometimes the broken things are the strongest, because they had to learn how to keep standing. One afternoon, Private Walsh brought a gift, a small radio he'd borrowed from another soldier. Music, he explained to Chen. Maybe they'd like to hear music? They turned it on carefully, keeping the volume low. An American jazz song played, completely foreign to the women's ears. They listened curiously. Then a slower song came on, a ballad with a female vocalist. Akiko's eyes widened. She recognized the emotion in the singer's voice. Even if she didn't understand the words, she began to cry. But they were different tears. Release, perhaps. Recognition that beauty still existed in the world. Thank you, she said to Walsh in English, her first English words. Thank you. Walsh smiled, his young face lighting up. You're welcome. You're very welcome. The women began to develop individual routines. Sarah woke early and helped prepare breakfast. Reiko drew for an hour each afternoon. Harumi read. Elizabeth had found some Japanese books through military intelligence, old texts that had been confiscated. One was a poetry collection. Harumi read poems aloud sometimes, and the other women listened. The familiar language, speaking of cherry blossoms and moonlight and seasons changing, reminded them of a Japan that existed before war, before horror. Physical healing accompanied emotional healing. The women's bodies, given adequate food and rest, began to recover. Wounds healed. Hair grew healthier. Faces filled out. But Elizabeth knew that internal healing was more complex. She noticed that Reiko still couldn't stand to have her back to a door, that Sarah sometimes dissociated during conversation, her eyes going distant, that Akiko had nightmares that woke the entire tent. Trauma doesn't just disappear because you're safe now, Elizabeth explained to Patterson. It's going to take years, maybe decades, for them to fully process this. What we're seeing now is just the beginning. But it is a beginning, Patterson observed. Yes, Elizabeth agreed. It is. One evening, as the sun set over the Pacific, Sarah stood outside the tent, watching the colors spread across the sky. She realized she had stopped bracing for the next horrible thing to happen. Not completely, she still had moments of panic. But right now, in this moment, she felt something she'd thought was gone forever. She felt almost peaceful. Mitchell walked by on his evening rounds and paused. Beautiful sunset, he said. Sarah didn't understand all the words, but she understood his meaning. Yes, she replied in English. Beautiful. It was a small exchange, but it felt significant. An American soldier and a Japanese victim of war, sharing a moment of simple appreciation for natural beauty. Perhaps that was its own form of healing, the recognition that despite everything, the world still contained moments worth noticing. Safe, Sarah said, testing the word. Yes, Mitchell confirmed. You're safe. She nodded slowly. Maybe, just maybe. She was starting to believe it. Not everyone in the camp understood or supported what Patterson was doing. Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Thornton arrived on a routine inspection in the third week. He was a by-the-book officer, 52 years old, who had rigid views about military protocol and resources. Colonel Patterson, Thornton said, reviewing the camp layout, explain why you've allocated this much space and these resources to Japanese civilians. Patterson stood his ground. They're victims of war crimes, sir. They require medical care and protection. They're Japanese nationals. We have limited resources. American wounded should be the priority. American wounded are being cared for properly, Patterson replied, his voice level but firm. These women aren't taking resources from our people. They're using excess capacity. Thornton examined the supply logs. Special food requests. Additional medical attention. Guards posted. This looks like VIP treatment for enemy nationals. With respect, sir, they're not enemy nationals, they're victims. There's a difference. The Pentagon might disagree. These women serviced Japanese military. They were of the enemy infrastructure. Patterson's face flushed red. They were prisoners, slaves. They had no choice. We only have their word for that. You want proof? Patterson's voice rose. Talk to Captain Harrison. Read the medical reports. Look at their condition when they arrived. No one volunteers for that. Thornton was unmoved. I'm recommending they be transferred to the General POW facility. This camp is for legitimate military operations, not refugee work. I will oppose that recommendation strenuously, Patterson said. Your opposition is noted. But this is above your pay grade, Colonel. That evening, Patterson called an emergency meeting with his senior staff. Thornton wants to move them to the POW camp, he told them. That can't happen. They'd be vulnerable to retaliation from Japanese soldiers who see them as traitors. Or worse, from our own people who don't understand the situation. We could explain it to the POW camp commanders, suggested Major Frank Chen, no relation to Private Chen. Explain what? that these women need special protection because they were sexually enslaved by the Japanese military. You think that information stays confidential? Within a day, everyone knows, and these women become targets. Elizabeth spoke up. Colonel, if they're moved, I'm moving with them. They need consistent medical and psychiatric care. I appreciate that, Captain, but I need you here for our wounded. Then the women stay here, Elizabeth said flatly. Patterson appreciated her support but knew it might not be enough. He spent the night drafting a detailed report, documenting everything. The women's condition upon arrival, their medical needs, the humanitarian imperative of protecting them. He concluded, moving these women would violate every principle of human decency that America claims to represent. If we cannot protect victims of our enemy's worst crimes, then what moral authority do we have to judge anyone? Meanwhile, in the women's tent, they sensed something was wrong. The Americans were tense, having urgent conversations. Sarah asked Chen what was happening. He hesitated, then decided honesty was better. Some officers want to move you to a different camp. Colonel Patterson is fighting to keep you here. The reaction was immediate. Reiko began hyperventilating. Several women started crying. Harumi's face went gray. They will send us away? She asked. Colonel Patterson is trying to prevent it, Chen assured her. But trust, still so fragile, cracked under the weight of this news. They had known it was too good to be true. The kindness had an expiration date. That night, Akiko had the worst nightmare yet. She screamed so loudly that the guards outside came running, thinking someone was being attacked. It took Elizabeth and Mary 30 minutes to calm her down. I dreamed they gave us to new soldiers, Akiko sobbed. I dreamed it was starting again. That won't happen, Elizabeth promised. I swear to you, that won't happen. But even as she said it, she wondered if she could keep that promise. The next morning, Thornton called Patterson to his temporary office. I've reviewed your report. It's very passionate. But passion isn't policy. Human rights should be policy. Human rights have to be balanced against military necessity. There's no military necessity here. This is about convenience and appearances. Thornton leaned back. You're not seeing the bigger picture, Patterson. We're going to be occupying Japan soon. There will be investigations, tribunals. These women are witnesses to war crimes. They need to be in proper legal custody. Legal custody? Patterson's voice was dangerous. They need therapy and safety, not legal custody. Nevertheless, that's the recommendation I'm sending up the chain. The decision will be made in Tokyo. After Thornton left, Patterson returned to his office and found his senior staff waiting. We're with you, sir, Mitchell said. All of us. Whatever you need. I need a miracle, Patterson muttered. Or at least someone higher up who understands basic humanity. Captain Williams, the chaplain, had been quietly observing everything. That night, he did something unusual. He used his personal connections to send a message directly to General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters. Williams and MacArthur had served together years ago. It was a long shot, but Williams wrote a detailed letter describing the situation, the women's condition, and the moral imperative of protecting them. These women represent everything the Japanese military did wrong, Williams wrote. How we treat them will show the world what America does right. We cannot claim moral superiority while treating victims as inconveniences. He sent the letter through unofficial channels, bypassing the normal chain of command. 3 days later, a response came. Not from MacArthur himself, but from one of his senior aides, Brigadier General Thomas Crawford. Crawford had daughters himself and had been deeply affected by reports of atrocities against women throughout the Pacific. Crawford arrived at the camp unannounced, wearing his full uniform, accompanied by 2 aides. Thornton nearly had a heart attack. General Crawford, this is unexpected. Show me the women, Crawford said, cutting him off. Patterson escorted Crawford to the tent area. Crawford insisted on speaking with the women directly. Through Chen as translator, he spent an hour listening to their stories. He asked pointed questions about their current care, their needs, their fears about being moved. When Reiko showed him her drawings, he studied them carefully. You have talent, he said through Chen. After this war, you could study art properly. Would you like that? Reiko looked shocked that someone so high-ranking would ask her opinion. Yes, she whispered. I would like that. Crawford also spoke with Elizabeth, reviewing medical records. He examined Patterson's supply logs to verify that resources weren't being diverted from military necessities. Finally, he gathered everyone, Thornton, Patterson, the senior staff, and surprisingly, the women themselves. I've seen enough, Crawford said. Here's my decision, and it comes with General MacArthur's authority. These women remain here under Colonel Patterson's protection until alternative arrangements can be made with the Red Cross or other humanitarian organizations. They will not be transferred to any POW facility. They will not be treated as prisoners or legal witnesses unless they voluntarily agree to testify. They are, as of now, classified as protected persons under military humanitarian provisions. Thornton's face reddened. General, I must protest. Your protest is noted and overruled. Furthermore, Lieutenant Colonel, I'm reassigning you to administrative duties in Manila. You lack the temperament for field command where human judgment is required. Thornton sputtered but said nothing. Crawford turned to the women. Ladies, what happened to you was a crime against humanity. America did not cause your suffering, but we have a responsibility to help you heal from it. That's what Colonel Patterson and his staff have been doing, and they will continue to do so. Through Chen, the women heard these words. Some cried with relief. Others simply sat in stunned silence. Moreover, Crawford continued, I'm authorizing additional resources for this camp specifically for your care. Medical staff, supplies, and anything else Colonel Patterson deems necessary. The cost is minimal compared to what we owe to basic human decency. After Crawford left, the tent was silent for a long moment. Then Harumi stood up and bowed deeply, not the desperate, terrified prostration from their first day, but a genuine gesture of gratitude. Please tell him, she said to Chen, that he has saved our lives twice. Once from death, and once from despair. That evening, Patterson gathered his staff. We dodged a bullet, he said. Or rather, Chaplain Williams dodged it for us. Thank you, Robert. Williams shrugged. I just wrote a letter. Crawford made the decision. You gave him the information he needed to make the right decision. Patterson corrected. That matters. Mitchell spoke up. Sir, what happens to them long term? Crawford mentioned the Red Cross. I'm guessing they'll help repatriate them or find them asylum in neutral countries. Some might not want to return to Japan. There's still a stigma around what happened to them. They might face rejection from their own families and communities. That's not fair, said Walsh. No, Patterson agreed. But when has fair ever been relevant in war? Elizabeth had been quiet throughout the meeting. Now she spoke. Whatever happens next, we've given them something important. We've shown them that not everyone in the world is cruel, that kindness still exists. For some of them, that might be enough to keep going. Let's make sure it is enough, Patterson said. We've got time now. Let's use it well. In the women's tent, for the first time since they'd arrived, the atmosphere was genuinely calm. They were staying. They were safe. The Americans had fought for them, protected them, chosen their well-being over bureaucratic convenience. Sarah lay on her cot that night, staring at the tent ceiling. She thought about her mother's garden again, but this time the memory didn't hurt quite as much. Maybe, someday, she could have a garden again. Maybe, someday, she could rebuild something resembling a life. It seemed impossible. But then again, so had kindness. So had safety. So had cheeseburgers and sandwiches served with genuine care. If those impossible things could happen, maybe other impossible things could too. The 15th of August, 1945. The announcement came over the radio. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. The American camp erupted in celebration. Men who had fought for years across the Pacific could finally imagine going home. There was cheering, crying, letters being written to loved ones. In the women's tent, the reaction was more complex. It's over, Sarah said, speaking to no one in particular. The war is over, but what did that mean for them? The war that had destroyed their lives was over. But could they ever return to who they'd been before? Harumi voiced what they were all thinking. What happens to us now? That evening, Patterson visited with Chen to explain. The Red Cross is coordinating repatriation for displaced persons. You have choices. You can return to Japan if you want. You can request asylum in other countries. Or you can stay here temporarily while things are sorted out. Go back to Japan? Reiko looked terrified. Everyone will know. Everyone will know what happened to us. Not necessarily, Patterson said gently. You don't have to tell anyone anything you don't want to. But they all knew how it worked. Small communities, rumors, stigma. Women who'd been through what they had were often treated as if they were responsible for their own victimization. Some families would be welcoming, but others would see them as sources of shame. I can't go back, Akiko said firmly. I won't go back to my village. Everyone would know my father. They would pity me or hate me. I can't live like that. Several others agreed. The Japan they remembered was gone, and they weren't sure they fit into whatever would replace it. Over the next few weeks, Red Cross representatives visited. They helped the women understand their options. Some chose repatriation despite their fears they wanted to see their families again, regardless of the cost. Others requested asylum in the Philippines, Australia, or even America. Sarah was one of the undecided. She thought about her mother, who might still be alive. But she also thought about the humiliation of returning home after what had happened. Elizabeth sat with her one afternoon. There's no right answer, Elizabeth said. Whatever you choose, it will be hard, but you'll survive it. You've survived worse. Have I? Sarah asked. I'm alive, but I don't know if I've survived. I don't know who I am anymore. You're someone who draws strength from poetry, Elizabeth said. Someone who helps organize medical supplies even though no one asked you to. Someone who learned English words because she wanted to connect with the people around her. That's who you are. Sarah considered this. Maybe I could go to Manila. Start over where no one knows my history. That's an option. The Red Cross can help arrange it. As the weeks passed, arrangements were finalized. Of the 17 women, 5 chose to return to Japan. 8 requested asylum in other countries. 4, including Sarah, decided to stay in Manila, at least temporarily. The day before the first group was scheduled to leave, Patterson organized a small ceremony. He gathered the entire camp, every soldier who could be spared from duty. These women survived one of the worst things human beings can do to each other, Patterson told his assembled troops. They survived because they're strong, but they also survived because when they arrived here, you all chose to treat them with dignity and respect. You chose to see them as human beings, not as the enemy, not as problems, but as people who deserved care. I'm proud of that. That's who we are. That's who America should be. The soldiers stood at attention as each woman walked past, heading toward the trucks that would take them to their next destination. The Americans saluted. It was an extraordinary gesture. Military salutes for civilian women, for former victims, for people who technically had been of the enemy nation. But it felt right. Harumi, who was returning to Japan despite her fears, stopped in front of Patterson. Thank you, she said in English words she'd practiced for this moment. You save us. You show us. World is not only dark. Patterson had to clear his throat before responding. You saved yourselves. We just gave you a safe place to do it. She smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from her, and bowed. Then she continued walking, her head high. When it was Sarah's turn, she stopped in front of Mitchell. Thank you for the first day, she said in English. For being kind when I was afraid. Mitchell nodded. Good luck in Manila. I hope you find what you're looking for there. I hope I find myself, Sarah replied, and Mitchell was struck by the wisdom in that statement. Reiko, heading to Australia with several others, gave Elizabeth a drawing she'd made, a portrait of Elizabeth tending to one of the women. So you remember, Reiko said. Through Chen. I could never forget, Elizabeth replied, her voice thick with emotion. Akiko, who was going to the Philippines, hugged Walsh impulsively. He was startled but returned the embrace gently. You are a good person, she said in broken English. You help me remember that good persons exist. As the trucks pulled away, the women looked back at the camp. It had been a prison camp, technically. But for them, it had been the place where they learned to be human again. The remaining women who were staying temporarily would be transferred to a Red Cross facility in Manila within days. But for now, they remained in the camp, in the space that had become unexpectedly safe. That evening, Sarah sat outside her tent, watching the sunset again. Mitchell joined her, as had become their routine. Scared? He asked. Yes, she admitted. But also, hopeful? Is that the right word? It's exactly the right word, Mitchell confirmed. What will you do? Sarah asked. After war, go home to Iowa. Marry my fiancé. Maybe become a teacher. Something peaceful. Teacher is good, Sarah said. I wanted to be teacher. Before. Maybe you still can be, Mitchell suggested. In Manila. Or wherever you end up. Sarah considered this. The idea of teaching seemed as distant as the moon, but Mitchell's matter-of-fact tone made it sound almost possible. Maybe, she said softly. Maybe I can. 20 years later. 1965. Iowa. James Mitchell, now a high school history teacher, received an envelope with unfamiliar postage. His wife, Anne, handed it to him at breakfast. Looks like it's from the Philippines, she noted. Mitchell opened it carefully and pulled out a letter written in careful English. Dear Mr. Mitchell, you may not remember me. My name is Sarah Kimura, though I use my married name now, Sarah Torres. 20 years ago, you found me and 16 other women in a wooden building on a small island. You gave us water. You promised we would be safe. You kept that promise. I am writing to tell you that the cheeseburger you and your friends gave us that morning saved more than our bodies. It saved our souls. For the first time in years, someone fed us like we mattered, like we were human beings worth caring for. I wanted you to know what happened to me after. I stayed in Manila. I learned English properly. I met a kind man who didn't judge my past. We married and have 3 children now. I teach at a small school poetry and literature, the thing I dreamed of before the war. Sometimes I tell my students that during the darkest time in my life, a stranger showed me kindness when he didn't have to. I tell them that kindness is what makes us human, not our nationality or our history. I hope you are well. I hope you found the peaceful life you wanted. Thank you for giving me the chance to find mine. With deepest gratitude, Sarah. Mitchell sat at the breakfast table, reading the letter 3 times. His eyes were wet. James? Anne asked, concerned. It's from one of the women, he said. From the camp. She's okay. She's a teacher. She has a family. She's okay. Anne knew the story. Mitchell had told her everything after he came home, needing to process what he'd seen and done. She squeezed his hand. That's wonderful. I didn't think I'd ever know, Mitchell said. I've wondered for 20 years. Hoped they were okay but never knew. Over the next few years, other letters arrived. One from Reiko in Australia, who had become a professional artist. Her work was displayed in galleries, and she had recently done a series about survival and rebirth that had received critical acclaim. One from Akiko, who had started a choir in Manila. I found my voice again, she wrote. Not just for singing, but for living. Thank you for helping me remember I had a voice worth finding. One even from Harumi, who had returned to Japan and, against all odds, had been welcomed back by her family. She had become a quiet advocate for victims of wartime sexual violence, working with younger women who had experienced trauma. What happened to us was unforgivable, she wrote. But what you did, the kindness you showed, proved that humanity wasn't completely lost. That matters more than I can say. In 1975, Mitchell traveled with his family to the Philippines. He had been planning it for years, and finally, the time was right. He met Sarah at her school in Manila. She was 51 now, her hair showing gray, her face lined with age but also with laugh lines. When she saw him, she cried and then laughed at herself for crying. "I promised myself I wouldn't cry," she said. "But seeing you brings back that day. The first day I believed I might survive." They spent an afternoon together, talking about their lives. Sarah showed him her school, introduced him to her children, pointed out the garden she kept behind her house. "Cherry blossoms," Mitchell noticed. "I planted them myself," Sarah said, "to remember where I came from, but also to show myself that beautiful things can grow even in places that knew darkness." Mitchell met several of the other women too during that trip. They gathered for a meal together, these survivors who had built lives from ashes. At one point, Reiko raised her glass. "To the soldiers who chose kindness," she said. "And to us, for choosing to keep living." They drank. And Mitchell felt overwhelmed by the resilience of these women. They had been broken, but they had refused to stay broken. Before he left, Sarah gave him something, a thin volume of poetry she had published. "These are poems I wrote over the years," she explained. "Some are about the dark times, but most are about the light that came after." Mitchell opened to a random page and read, "In the depths of hell, a stranger offered water, then bread, then safety, then hope. He didn't know he was teaching me. That kindness is the language all humans speak when we remember. We are human." Mitchell closed the book carefully. "Sarah, I didn't do anything special. We just treated you like people. That was everything," Sarah said simply. "When you've forgotten you're a person, being treated like one is a miracle." Years later, in 1989, Mitchell was invited to speak at a university about his wartime experiences. He was 70 years old now, white-haired and slower moving, but still sharp. He told the story of finding the women, of the cheeseburgers that made them weep, of Colonel Patterson's fight to protect them, of letters that arrived decades later. "I've done a lot of things in my life," Mitchell concluded, "but nothing mattered more than those few weeks. Because we had a choice. We could have treated them as the enemy, as problems, as inconveniences, but we chose to treat them as human beings. And that choice rippled forward through time. Those women built lives, raised children, created art, taught students, all because we gave them safety and cheeseburgers and basic dignity." He paused, looking at the young faces in the audience. "That's what I want you to remember in your lives. You'll have chances to choose kindness when it's not required, when it's not convenient, when it might cost you something. Choose it anyway, because you never know what ripples that choice will create." The audience stood and applauded, but Mitchell wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about 17 frightened women in a tent, crying over sandwiches, beginning the long journey back to humanity. He was thinking about Sarah's garden, where cherry blossoms bloomed in Manila soil. He was thinking about Reiko's art, Akiko's choir, Harumi's advocacy. He was thinking about all the children and grandchildren those women had raised, all the students they'd taught, all the people they'd touched with their resilience and grace. And he was thinking that maybe, just maybe, in the darkest chapters of human history, small acts of kindness were the things that mattered most. Not because they erased the darkness they couldn't, but because they proved the darkness didn't have to be permanent. Because they showed that even in hell, humanity could survive. Because a cheeseburger, given with genuine care to someone who had forgotten what care felt like, could save not just a life but a soul. And sometimes, that was enough. In 2010, a small memorial was erected in Manila by descendants of the Comfort Women. It depicted hands holding bread, a simple image but profoundly meaningful. The plaque read, "For the soldiers who chose compassion over vengeance, for the women who chose life over surrender, for all who remember that humanity's greatest weapon is kindness." Sarah Torres, 90 years old, attended the dedication. She stood with Reiko and Akiko, the 3 survivors who remained. They held hands, these elderly women who had been girls together in hell and who had grown old together in light. "We lived," Sarah said simply, "despite everything. We lived." "More than lived," Reiko corrected. We thrived. We created. We loved. We remembered what it meant to be human, Akiko added. And we never forgot who helped us remember. The memorial stands today, a quiet reminder that in war's darkest moments, small acts of extraordinary kindness can echo through generations, proving that humanity, once lost, can always be found again, sometimes in the most unexpected places, sometimes in the simple gift of a cheeseburger and a promise that says, "You are safe now. You are human. You matter." And that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all.